How are folks doing this morning, afternoon?
Pretty good.
Good, good. There's a lot of you here, far more than I had expected to to link in. This is actually fantastic. I mean, just a general survey. I mean, we don't know yet because we haven't got started, but do people like this format, being able to link in for sort of live lectures in addition to being able to? Okay, cool. Well, we'll talk about this. I'm asking a biased sample because you all linked in, and the people who I see give me thumbs up all have their video on, which is if you didn't want to be here, you probably would have opted not to. But that's all right. It's good that this is working out for folks. I guess we can get started. I'm gonna go through, hit record there. All right. Just a couple announcements before we get going. One thing I want to remind everybody if I send out one of those announcements through WIO courses, that's how I'm going to like shotgun you all with announcements and things like that. So if something pops into your inbox, I try and identify those as being from our class. So do make sure that you go through and read those. There'll be important information in there. So make sure that you're monitoring those. Again, those announcements. And if you miss one or accidentally delete it from your inbox, you can go to WIO courses, go to the announcements section there and go back through and take a look. So right now we've got stuff on text options, how to access Launchpad. There's a link on there and things like that. So if you have questions, make sure to go back through and take a look at that. Other thing too, again, remember, don't worry about getting into SONA or that research site quite yet. We still have some maintenance to do on that. So, and if you go through, you probably won't find our class in there. I need to go through, get that stuff updated. So don't worry about that too much right now. Samantha, are you in the mix here?
Yes.
Okay. Do you want to tell people about SI on Thursdays?
Yeah. So, after speaking with Dr. Clapp, I think I decided, actually one second, my fan is on and I think it's giving some over noise. Okay, sorry about that. After speaking with Dr. Clapp, I decided to do SIs on Thursdays at 6:30. And we'll be sending out an announcement for that as well as a reminder. And right now, I don't think Jess has quite invited everyone to the YO group. I think she's waiting till the last add date, which she should be adding people to the YO group on Friday or Saturday. And in that YO group, you'll be able to see a link to the SI. It's all on a homepage. You'll be able to see a link to the SI, different notes about what you should expect for the SI sessions. And that's where I'll be posting some worksheets for everyone as well. And I can send this all out in an announcement as well, just as time gets a little bit closer. But as far as you guys need to know, it'll be on Thursdays at 6:30. And then if throughout the semester we find that time isn't going to be the best time for everybody, then we can discuss for the people who are wanting to come when a better time might be. But right now, that seems like it'll be the best time as far as just everybody's schedules go. And so, yeah, I'll be sending out an announcement. You guys can look forward to seeing that later this week. And you'll get an invitation from Jess. I think she said, either Friday or Saturday. And all you'll have to do is click on the invitation, and then it'll show a YO group, and you just have to click accept. It'll be in the top right-hand corner when you see that. It might not make a ton of sense right now, but it'll make sense when she sends out that invitation. And then you'll have a whole page just dedicated to SI and our SI sessions.
So, quick question, Samantha. Will you have an SI session tomorrow?
No, we will not be having an SI session tomorrow. We give a full week before SI sessions start.
Okay.
And then that way we just have more material to go over.
Okay, cool. So you probably won't have an SI session before our first quiz, but that's all right. This first section is just covers a couple different modules. We'll cover 3 lectures. So before that, if you have questions about materials or things aren't making sense, make sure to get in touch with Samantha. Make sure to get in touch with me. Reach out to Natalie. So just make sure that utilize those office hours and let us know if you're struggling with anything. Okay. Thanks, Samantha. Other thing, upon reflection, I don't know that the lockdown browser situation is going to work so well. Seems like the browser that the university is using isn't compatible with Chromebooks. And I know a lot of people have Chromebooks because they're an affordable option, given that a lot of our stuff is moved online. And so I'm probably just going to drop that. Okay. So if you've been going through trying to figure out how to get that browser downloaded and stuff like that, you can pull the plug on that. Now, what I will say is it's possible that either this semester or down the road that you may run into a class where the instructor does want you to have that. And with us, with 150 students in the class, it's just not manageable to try and expect everybody to get on the same page, and it would turn into a disaster. If you're in a smaller class, your instructor might say, no, I want you to have that lockdown browser. It's going to be important. Sounds like IT has some programs available where they have laptops that you can check out or something like that to run through evaluations and things like that. So if you do have a Chromebook or some other platform that doesn't support that web browser, and you run into this in other classes, there's stuff that I think the university has tried to set up to get around that. But for this class, don't worry about it. It was a good idea. Turned out it failed. That happens a lot in research. So we'll just move forward with that. Does that sound all right to everybody? Thumbs up for thinking that's an okay thing? Okay, cool. Nice. All right. I think that is about it in terms of announcement stuff. Any questions that people have before we jump into material today? Feeling good about this? Okay, cool. So what we're going to do is we're going to start out with this first section talking about some historical figures, movements in psychology. My goal here is to give you kind of a sense for how psychology is developed as a science. This is a very new area of research, or psychology as a formal field hasn't been around nearly as long as some other areas, and so wanting to get a sense for how ideas in psychology is developed, how we think about things, how we study things. And for those of you who are psychology majors who are going to go on to take more classes, these are names and movements that are going to keep popping up again and again, both in this class, but as you move forward in your coursework. Okay. So big question. What is psychology, right? If we think about psychology, I've got a word cloud here. It involves human experience and human thoughts and behaviors and emotions and personality and things like that. So anything that involves humans is going to involve psychology in some way, right? And so this is one of the really fun things about teaching this class is it's hard to find anything that people do that doesn't have some aspect of psychology that gets hooked into it. But as we've developed as a field, questions about what topics are relevant to psychology, what types of things should we be studying, how do we go about studying these things, what are our methods that we use as psychologists, where should we be spending our time and effort and things like that. These things have shifted quite a great deal over the course of the history of psychology as an area of study in science. And so today, there's no one definition of psychology, but the one your text uses, and I think it's a pretty good one, identifying psychology as the scientific study of the mind and behavior. That kind of captures pretty broadly. It's not super specific, but it's functional, I think, as good as any definition of psychology. And the thing is, we're going through and working on this semester, talking about different areas. We're going to be talking about biological influences that influence thoughts, behavior, emotions, things like that, different psychological factors, and different sociocultural factors. What are we talking about? Sociocultural factors. Anybody?
Things that you grew up around.
Yeah. Kind of our culture, our environment. So those of you, people who are out of state, give me a shout out. Okay. Okay. Right. So we've got some folks who are not from Wyoming, right? And I imagine that some of you who are not from Wyoming have already identified some different sort of things that are different in terms of sort of cultural issues or cultural things or just general stuff. These are the types of things that, here, I'm trying to figure out my chat. All right, there we go. That start to play into how we behave, how we interact with other people and things along those lines, okay? And so what we're going to go through today is talk about how these different people, figures, movements has started to shape sort of how we're going around and talking about psychology. All right. So, other thing, as we go through and we're talking about these different movements, one of the things that starts to get difficult is keeping this all straight in your head, okay? Because there's going to be movements that sound like other movements, and how do I sort of map this all out? What you should do and how I'm going to present this is thinking about, like anything else, right? Trends come and go, right? In fashion, in music, in sort of culture, right? We're into something for a while, and then people start to sort of not like the drawbacks or be like, oh, we're missing this thing. So this thing is out and this new thing is in. We're going to direct our attention here, right? And so we're going to do that for a while. Then we don't like that because of X, Y, and Z. And then we shift and do something else for a while. Psychology is the same thing. So as you're thinking about and trying to organize and keep in your head what these different movements are doing, try and use that as a mechanism. Thinking about each successive movement is kind of a reaction to previous movements. That'll help keep things squared away a little bit better. Okay. So what were we doing before we had psychology as a formalized field? Well, a lot of the writing and the thinking about human consciousness, human nature, just the mind in general, this was being done over in philosophy. Do I got any philosophy majors in lecture right now? Yeah, there's not that many. It's not a big major. Not a lot of people going into philosophy these days. It's really cool. But before psychology got formalized as a sort of an area of study, folks like Aristotle looking at the basis of intellect, like how do we sort of what is intelligence and what is intellect? Descartes looking at how the mind links in with the body and how are those two things connected. Locke thinking about how do we acquire knowledge? How do we come to know things, right? Are we born with some sort of built-in information, or is it all blank slate and we just pick things up as we move through? So before psychology was formalized, this was the type of stuff, or these were the types of folks who were working in this area. Now, psychology really started to formalize in a field around the late 19th century, so late 1800s. And what was going on at this time is you had Germany. Germany was a real powerhouse of academics and science and things along those lines. And so what was going on at this time is what universities in Germany were starting to expand formalized sciences and areas of study, things like biology, chemistry, some of these natural sciences, and starting to expand these out into other areas, things that we might think about as social sciences now. And what the structuralists, and so the primary objective at this time, again, and we can think about if biology is coming up. So all of a sudden we've got scientists sort of understanding, hey, we've got the body is made up of cells, and these cells are made up of specific components that work together to sort of create organisms and things. And we have folks in chemistry. Chemistry is an established science, right? We sort of this idea of periodic table of elements. So all the things around us are built up of these different atoms and sort of coming up with these different compounds and things along those lines, right? And so in Germany, in the late 19th century, the idea was to start looking at and approaching the study of consciousness in the mind as trying to identify the individual pieces, the individual structures of the mind. Okay, so again, influenced heavily by hard sciences, and so the idea was to say, okay, what are the basic building blocks? What are the primary components of things like attention, sensation, perception? How do I see? What are the basic building blocks of consciousness? Okay, so as we get into this initial area, things like the soul or higher powers, afterlife, things like these, sort of the meaning of life, things along those lines, were considered to be something that's an area for philosophers to talk about. What we're going to look at in a structured way is look at the basic building blocks of consciousness, right? And so as a consequence, this initial movement was known as structuralism. Okay, so if you think about structuralism, thinking about very early on, when we're first jumping into this, we're saying, what are the individual building blocks of consciousness? Okay. Now, a couple people who were influential in this, William Wundt, again, an author or a professor in Germany. Wundt, again, his goal was to identify the atoms of the mind. Like, that's how he was thinking about this. What are the basic building blocks of consciousness? How can I break this down into sort of individual subcomponents of consciousness? And so Wundt often will be referred to as the father of psychology, not because anything that he did today is necessarily super relevant, but just because he was the first to try and kind of formalize this stuff. Edward Titchener, a student of Wundt, again, another big person in this movement, again, looking at trying to reduce the mind down to three fundamental elements. Sensations, that's feelings; images, that's thoughts; and affections, which is going to be emotions and things like that. So again, these guys were trying to reduce things down and say, okay, we're going to take this out of the realm of religion, philosophy, and start looking at the basic building blocks of human consciousness. Okay. Questions about this? All right. So this was a good start. Okay. If we're going to be the first folks in the pool, like, we can't criticize sort of how we go about things because too much, because we're kind of breaking new ground here. But one of the things that the structuralists use as their primary area or way of knowing things was a method called introspection. So at this time, research was just being done by just a handful of professors in Germany and their graduate students, right? So just only sort of a few sort of really, really smart, really, really highly qualified individuals trying to go through. And so the idea was, with introspection, was that the only people who can really speak to an experience is the person who's experiencing it, right? So if I ask you how you're feeling right now, you can tell me, but you're really the only one who actually is feeling that at that time, right? And so the structuralists decided that what we needed to do to understand and draw conclusions about human consciousness was to go through and get people to report on their own experience, okay? So what we would do is have, say, a graduate student come into the lab and would give them something to do over and over and over and over and over again, okay? So let's say, can you hear that? You hear that? Okay. Cameron, I'm going to pick on you just because I can see you in my screen right here. All right. I want you to raise your hand as fast as you hear this sound, right? Okay. Slow, probably a lag and things like that. Okay, we're going to do it again. Okay, so, and what we would do, Cameron's my graduate student, and we're just going to do this over and over and over again, or I'm going to have him listen to different sounds or look at different things and start to describe those things and his experience of those things. And we're just going to do that over and over and over again with highly trained people to try and understand what's going on, how the mind is processing information. Okay, so a lot of information. I'm working with Cameron, and I'm teaching him how to respond and how to react and how to describe things in a way that will help us sort of get down at stuff. Okay, but Any ideas on one of the major limitations of introspection?
So I was wondering if it's two people who were trained so that didn't include anyone else.
What's that, Kate?
So it was more specific to people who were only trained and not everyone else.
Yeah, hard to get a lot of agreement, right? So let's say, so here we got a square up. Someone tell me what color this is.
Teal.
Okay, so we got
Light blue.
teal, light blue. What else?
Like olive green.
Got an olive green,
It's like a grayish green.
a grayish green.
Sea blue.
Oh, sea green. Okay, so we've got, even with this, right? This is a kindergarten thing. What color is this, right? But as we start to get into nuances here, we have some people seeing this more as a blue, more as a green, different shades of green. How do we go through and resolve those differences? We can't, right? And so one of the things that in terms of criticism of introspection, a nice try, but again, if we have differences across people and how they're experiencing things, it's hard to say this person is right and this person is wrong. Other thing that happens is that we as human beings are notoriously poor observers of our own behavior. If I ask someone why they did something, they're going to give me an answer, but if we study it and look at it closely, that's probably not why they did it, or there are other things outside of their awareness that might have influenced things. And so just relying on people's own introspection starts to become a problem. Okay. So people kind of get the gist of structuralism and what's going on here.
Wouldn't it like kind of be biased also?
Yeah.
Because they've been trained to see this way.
Yeah, super biased, right? Or could be super biased. Now, they tried to cut it down, right? So I'm having you, Sage, do the same task over and over and over again to try and get some reliability in terms of like sort of some consistency in your reporting. And so they were trying to get it standardized, but it's just really hard to do if you're just working with like one person and not sort of getting a broad spectrum of things. Yeah. So, what happened then? And so we have structuralism kind of kicking off and sort of going around and doing some interesting stuff, starting to really shape the field. But about the middle of the sort of structuralism has been around for a while, and then American investigators start to become not happy with structuralism. Okay. Again, structuralism, the idea behind structuralism is looking at the basic building blocks of consciousness, right? And then we had folks in America who were saying, well, yeah, like, fine, whatever. I don't really care about what consciousness or what the building blocks are. What I'm interested in what it does. What does it do for us, right? And so the idea is this whole focus on the basic building blocks is missing the point. It's reductionist. What we should be looking at, not on the basic building blocks, but what's the function of different psychological processes. Specifically, how do these mental processes help organisms adapt and survive and sort of move forward, right? And so this shift in sort of the interest started to really emphasize context, okay? So people from this perspective would make an argument that our consciousness is always changing. It's unique across individuals. It's unique across situations. And if we just basically sort of boil things down to just someone listening to taps in a lab, we're missing the whole point of psychology behavior in general. Okay. And the big guy who is moving a lot of this, a gentleman named William James. Okay. And James, huge influence of Darwin. Okay. Charles Darwin's coming out with Origin of the Species, this idea of evolution and this idea that organisms respond to environment, and those with good adaptations survive and perpetuate their genes. Those who don't die out and are no longer there. And so the focus of James's functionalism movement wasn't to try and understand what the basic building blocks was. James wanted to say, what does this do? Why does this function? Okay, so let's say, for example, if you've been around, or if you have brothers, sisters, kids of your own, cousins, or work in an area with tiny babies, what do tiny babies do a lot of the time? Yeah, they cry, right? They cry, they fuss, they scream, things along those lines. Does anybody have like a recording of baby fussing just that they just like to listen to on the reg? No, it's really really aversive, right? Why do babies cry and fuss? To communicate, right? That's that baby saying, I need something, right? So from a functionalist standpoint, what if we had a baby who didn't cry ever?
The best baby ever.
Yeah, until it didn't survive, right? Yeah, it's nice until it perished because it doesn't have a crying reflex to let adults know it doesn't have language, right? And so it's helpless. And so the idea behind the functionalism movement is saying, let's understand this crying behavior. Why do children cry? Well, it looks like this is maybe an evolutionary adaptation because kids who cry and the specific frequency of that is really hard for people to ignore. I can't just ignore a crying baby. So if I go through provide it needs, give it love, attention, food, things like that, then it stops, then it reinforces that. So the idea of this psychological process like crying, again, from a functionalist standpoint, I don't care what the basic building blocks of crying are. What I wanted to know is how it helps and sort of how it helps organisms survive. Yeah. So one of the things that was a big contribution of functionalism is what functionalism did is it started to take research out of the laboratory with eggheads like me, having people listen to taps and things along those lines, and started to spread it out into the world, into real life situations. And one of the tools that James utilized was called the comparative method. Okay, and the comparative method is again looking at and trying to observe different people, organisms, how they interact, how they behave, and trying to understand the functional processes of how that behavior started to develop. And so what this started to do is taking the study of psychology out of, again, the laboratory and start looking at behavior in populations that had never been looked at before. So infants, right? Infants are terrible at introspection because they have no language and can't describe anything. People with intellectual disabilities or emotional behavioral difficulties weren't a group that was studied. Animals, right? That wasn't a proper population to be looking at in terms of psychology, but the comparative method now started going through. Now we can go through and look at say packs of wolves or chimpanzees or any other organism and start to understand how behavior develops and the function and the adaptive process of that. Comparative method also started to pull in self-report, a lot of behavioral observation types of things. And so it took it out of very sterile, one person being observed in a laboratory and spread it out to the world. Okay. People see kind of the shift from functionalism away from structuralism and how these two movements were different in their emphasis and their methods. Questions? Okay, so this was good. This was a development. This was kind of a cool new thing, right? But not without its criticisms. There's never a theory that's got 100% correct or an approach that's got 100% correct. One of the things, and we still see this today, this battle between in a lot of different sciences, the push and pull between applied research or basic research and applied research. You can think about structuralism as being much more basic research. What are the fundamental building blocks? The applied functionalism is what do we do with that? Sort of what is the function, right? So if I'm working in chemistry and I'm looking at sort of individual components of atoms and things along those lines and how it all fits together, that's basic research. The applied research is how do we use these materials to improve our lives, do cool new things, sort of that type of thing, right? And so we still get this push and pull between basic and applied. The basic people will say, well, you need to know sort of the basic building blocks, otherwise you don't know anything. The applied people, like the functionalists, will say, you're worried, focused on the wrong thing. We should be focused on what it does, okay? And so, other thing too is underlying premises of functionalism. Sort of again based on sort of this idea of natural selection, tends to be controversial, continuing in some sort of areas, but in general, sort of a movement away from just pure lab-based research. So,
I have a question.
yeah, Colin.
So, would you say that evolutionary psychology and functionalism are still like applicable to modern society today and everything, or do you think that's kind of just bare bones of psychology?
It depends. It's the nuance, right? Structuralism, functionalism aren't like you're not going to find a psychologist today who identifies as a structuralist or a functionalist. That's kind of sort of prehistory origins. You'll have people who do work in evolutionary psychology, which is kind of an interesting area. We'll talk about that in a couple lectures down the road. So there are people who continue to rely maybe more heavily on some of these ideas and principles, but people who identify, oh, I'm a functionalist or I'm a structuralist, you wouldn't see that today. All right. So we've got movement, we've got structuralism, we've got functionalists, but then about the same time functionalism was developing in the U.S., psychoanalysis started to come up based on the work of Sigmund Freud. Who here has heard of Freud? Give me a shout out if you heard Freud. Woohoo! Yeah. We've all heard of Freud. Freud is ingrained in sort of our culture. Like he's not American, he's Austrian, right? But it's just in our sort of our collective consciousness, sort of Freud is a figure, right? Huge influence. And so Freud's perspective was a little bit different. He kind of wanted his own way. Freud was a medical doctor with a practice in clinical neurology in Austria. And very heavily influenced by Victorian culture. So does anybody know anything about Victorian culture in Europe in the late 1900s? So what was this area? What was going on at this time point in Europe? At least for socially. Anybody know?
Everything was very structured, especially socially. There were ways you had to behave, otherwise you were not accepted largely in society.
Yeah, perfect, Hannah. Absolutely right. We had a sort of a tiered structure to society that had very specific rules. Think Charles Dickens, like high collars, sleeves down to the waist, long skirts, sort of everything sort of shut down, buttoned up, very structured, right? And so living in this time, Freud started to develop this model of personality development, a philosophy of human nature that then led to a method of psychotherapy. Okay, so Freud kind of was doing his own thing off in Europe when the functionalists and the structuralists are sort of having their sort of beef back and forth. And what Freud believed was that behavior is deterministic. What do I mean? If something's deterministic, what does that mean? Predictable.
It's a sum of multiple different characteristics.
Okay. Yep. Both so due to different characteristics or influences, predictable. What else does deterministic mean? Do I have a choice if something's deterministic?
No, it's like almost like pre-planned. It's just going to happen.
Exactly, Michael. It's just what's going to happen is what's going to happen, right? I might have, and this was Freud's. So this was where Freud kind of took a different perspective relative to the other two. Freud's idea of behavior was that it's deterministic. We have the veneer of control. We think that we're in charge, but we're actually not. Our behavior is all determined by unconscious drives. And Freud's basic drives, we'll talk about some of this in a later lecture. Freud proposed that our behavior, kind of the major driving force, was life instincts. This was our drive for pleasure, growth, achievement, to go out and sort of build ourselves up. And contrasting that was this opposite instinct that we have all in us, this death instinct, this aggressive drive to hurt ourselves, hurt other people, to sabotage ourselves in any way possible, right? And so Freud's theory was fairly elaborate, but the basic idea was that everything that we do is not because, oh, I choose to do this. It's this force, this battle between these unconscious drives that are bubbling below the surface. Okay. Now, again, given Freud's background and growing up in the culture that he was growing in, really, really preoccupied with sexual drives and sexual behaviors and motivations and things like that. Too much. It was a lot. It went overboard. Not saying that sexual motivations don't drive behavior. It just doesn't have to drive all behavior all time in all contexts, right? But this idea of looking at and sort of understanding personality and human behavior, this was kind of the contribution of Freud's work in, again, the sort of late 1800s, early 1900s.
So did Freud believe that we are programmed to be self-destructive?
Yeah. In you, Colin, is an intense drive, or sort of a drive to damage yourself, damage other people, to ruin opportunities or good things in your life, right? Freud believed that this was an innate component of sort of all humans, okay? So some interesting sort of ideas, right? And the basis of Freud's work, as he was starting to build this together, was the case study. And so again, remember that Freud was a practicing clinical neurologist. Now, his psychologist wasn't necessarily a thing here. But what Freud was doing was working with people who had struggles with anxiety and depression and compulsive behaviors, and sort of to the point where they were coming in to talk with Freud to kind of work out their stuff. And so Freud's theory was based on these case studies of these people who were coming in to get help from him and sort of go through and work on this stuff. Okay. Now, criticisms of Freud's work is that if my entire philosophy on how humans work is based on people who are coming in because they're having difficulties, maybe that skews things off a little bit. Maybe that's not the best sample to be using, right? Also, Freud's approach really just based on his own sort of thoughts and feelings about stuff. There are no real controlled methods. There's no experiments. There's no systematic collection of data. There's no sort of good record keeping to go back through and check. And so the concern is that this theory and Freud, like all of us, are susceptible to confirmation bias. What is confirmation bias?
Picking out the answer to a narrative you've already constructed.
Yeah. I see what I want to see, right? I think this is the answer. I think this is how the world works. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to cherry pick pieces of information that are consistent with my worldview, and I'm going to ignore the stuff that's not consistent, right? And so Freud had some interesting ideas and some things that have value, but as a scientific approach, some big problems with this, okay? Questions about Freud?
I had a question.
Yeah.
So is it due to these criticisms and uncontrolled methods that psychoanalysis became more of a thing for like literature analysis than like an actual psychology analysis?
Oh, Michael, I could hug you through this screen right now. Yeah, I mean, psychoanalysis, there are people who practice, and so people who are trained in this area, who continue to practice in this area, but in terms of evidence-based treatments and things like that, some interesting ideas, and we're going to talk about Freud a little bit. He made good observations and sort of definitely identified tendencies that people have. It's just the explanations that he came up for those don't really square with what we know about how people actually work. There's a lot of kind of magical, mystical types of thing. And so amazing sort of opportunities for literature analysis and things along those lines. But in terms of actually understanding human behavior from a standpoint of psychological science, it starts to break down in a lot of areas. Yep. So we have psychoanalysis. We got Freud doing his thing. But as psychoanalysis is gaining traction in Europe, what we see back here in the States is a movement known as behaviorism. And the big reaction behaviorism had to psychoanalysis was this idea that behavior is determined by unconscious forces, so these mystical things that we can't see or measure. And what we had in America with the behaviorists are a group of folks who really, really, really wanted psychology to be a very, very specific behavioral science. Okay? And so the primary goal of behaviorism was to determine the rules that govern govern observable behavior. Okay? And when we get into these early behaviorists, we often will sometimes you hear them called radical behaviorists. These radical behaviorists were of the opinion that psychology should be limited to acts that can be directly observed. If I can't see it, if I can't observe you doing it, then it's useless for scientific study. Okay? Like, unless I can physically see what it is I'm studying, this isn't a thing. And to talk about it is like talking about space aliens and magic and stuff like that. It's not worth studying, right? So things like sensation, imagination, emotion, consciousness, right? If you were to ask an early behaviorist, oh, well, how does emotion play into this? They would laugh at you and say, I don't know what that means. Like, I can't see you feel something. I can see you express things, fine, but we'll talk about that as behavior. But your idea that, oh, you did this because you wanted to, because you chose to, I can't see choice. I can't sort of measure that. What I can do is I can look at stimulus response. I can look at things that are happening in your environment, and I can make a determination on how that influences your behavior. And if we capture all that stuff, that's the stuff that's going to go through and tell me be able to predict how you're going to respond to a given situation. So again, think about behaviorism as a reaction to the psychoanalysis. Behaviorists are going to say this idea of life instincts, death instincts, imagination, unconscious, those are useless ideas in terms of understanding human behavior. If I don't directly observe it and I can't identify this as a function of some aspect of form of learning, it's not worth talking about. Okay. And so these are folks that are doing a lot of animal research, rats in cages, pushing buttons and things like that, a lot of different conditioning paradigms, okay? And so a couple of important figures here. You've got Skinner. Skinner was very much involved in sort of the influence of reward and punishment following a behavior, okay? Michael, I'll use you because, again, you're just on my screen right now. Like if I have you push a button and that gives you something that, what do you like to eat, Michael? What's your favorite food?
I like Kit Kats.
Okay. You push a button and it gives you a Kit Kat. What are you going to keep doing? You're going to keep pushing that button, right? And so you're pushing that button for Kit Kats, and now all of a sudden you hit that button and it shocks you. What are you going to do? You're going to stop hitting the button, right? And so this is this idea of operant conditioning, and this is the type of thing that Skinner was really interested in. Watson, the father of behaviorism, much more interested in classical conditioning. These are these automatic responses, that I jump whenever I hear, let's say I was in combat, right? And whenever I hear a siren, it sort of conditioned me to have an intense physiological response. And so now anytime I hear a siren, I automatically hit down and have sort of heightened physiological response and things like that, this classically conditioned thing, right? These were the two guys who were really influential within this behaviorist revolution. So behaviorism, incredibly, incredibly, incredibly important. Maybe one of the most important movements for psychological sciences as we know it today. And again, this strict radical behaviorism perspective dominant for 50 years or so. Okay, and some of the benefits is pulling psychology to make it in much more structured and objective. And in terms of how we go through it, and even today, our interventions for modifying behavior hugely based on behaviorism and some of these behaviorist principles. Okay, but again, criticisms of behaviorism, particularly radical behaviorism, as we it was originally developed. This idea of rejection of free will and free choice doesn't make people happy, right? and reasonably so, right? Similar to psychoanalysis, behaviorism is very deterministic, right? Your behavior, you didn't choose to come to class today because you wanted to. Your behavior was determined by a series of situations in your past that have been punished or reinforced. You think you did, but it's actually a very deterministic model, and that your behavior in any situation is based on your learning history and past experiences. Okay. Also, this idea in radical behaviorism, refusing to or sort of recognize sort of this stuff that goes on in our head, thoughts, feelings, and things along those lines, dismissing those as unnecessary for understanding behavior, problematic, or gets questioned, reasonably so. And then again, sort of this idea that we can reduce human functioning to observable acts, right? So just to all of human experience is just basically your observable behaviors. There's a lot of stuff that goes on that sort of in our human experience that can't be reduced down to observable acts. Imagination, creativity, sort of experience and things like that fall outside the realm of what radical behaviorism was willing to consider, and so are criticized on that because of that. So these criticisms of behaviorism sparked this movement in humanistic psychology. Okay, the primary objective of the humanists was to think about and sort of try and come up with models that took into account to understand human strengths, aspirations, potential, achievement, free will. These are all dirty words from the context of behaviorism. These aren't things that I can see. I can't see your free will or your achievement or your potential. That's not a real thing to me if I'm a radical behaviorist. But you had a group of individuals who were saying, hey, this is nonsense, right? People do have free will. People do make choices, right? And so this humanistic movement came out as a reaction to both psychoanalysis and behaviorism, both hugely deterministic perspectives on behavior, to say, what about free will? What about the stuff that makes people great? What about the stuff that makes people excellent and drive people to succeed? The stuff that we see in documentaries and movies and books, what about that stuff? We want to put together a movement that addresses this, okay? And so again, a shift away from some of the behaviorist, the psychoanalysis stuff that was very deterministic, to place a different focus on human growth potential and things like that, okay? Major people in this movement going to be Maslow, okay? Looking at characteristics of exceptional individuals. If you've heard about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, this is Maslow right here. We also have Carl Rogers, Rogerian therapy, human-focused or humanistic therapy, interested in the capacity for growth and achievement, right? What are the things that we need to do? What are the necessary and sufficient conditions for us to grow as humans and be the best people that we can be? These are the types of things that the humanists were interested in doing. Okay. So, humanists, this movement came forward, and the goal was to supplant psychoanalysis and behaviorism, these deterministic theories of human behavior, with a different orientation. Didn't end up being a super strong influence on psychological science, but what the humanistic movement did have is a very, very strong influence on psychotherapy practice, models of counseling, and sort of help providing orientations and things along those lines. This idea that if we give people situations where they are in a relationship with unconditional and positive regard, someone who's there and will listen to them and just sort of be with them and help them work through things, that's sort of the humanistic perspective, right? So huge influence in areas of counseling or counseling psychology, some areas of clinical psychology, and positive psychology is a big sort of influence off of the humanistic movement. Okay. But again, criticisms of the humanistic movement, right? A lot of, particularly like Maslow's work, and we'll talk about this with self-actualization. Okay, this idea, the peak of the pyramid, where we've got people who have achieved sort of their greatest potential. This research is built on a very, very small collection of people like Einstein and Mother Teresa and sort of Mozart, and the extent to which that building an entire theory around just a handful of really truly exceptional people who aren't like the rest of us starts to become a controversial thing, right? A lot of Rogers' person-centered therapy, that humanistic therapy, based on sort of undergraduates, right? And again, not that you all aren't real people. It's just that you all are, by definition of being at a university, kind of exceptional relative to the rest of the universe, right? The opportunity to get a university education is not afforded to the vast majority of people in the universe, right? And so the concerns and the stuff that comes up, not that things can't be really intense and people don't go through really intense stuff, but in general, it's with respect to clinical work, this idea of unconditional support and empathy when we run into certain types of conditions. Sometimes it looks like we need a little bit more other than just unconditional positive regard to help people move forward past some of the difficulties they're having, right? So let's say, Jonathan, if you come up and you come to see me because you're struggling with obsessive compulsive disorder that's really impairing, being supportive of you probably isn't going to help you move past the OCD stuff, right? We need some additional techniques and things along those lines. And so for general sort of difficulties, humanistic stuff and person-centered stuff is fantastic, and it needs to be a part of any clinical work. But in a lot of cases, we need some additional things to help move people on sort of farther than they can get just based on that relationship stuff. Okay. All right. Last thing we'll talk about here is cognitive psychology, but we'll stop here because we're at time. I don't want to take you over. We'll pick up and finish up this last, I think it's just this last slide. Yeah, we'll pick up that last slide on Friday and then roll into some of the research stuff there. So, any questions about the movements we've talked about up to this point, or any of the criticisms or shifts in movements and things?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So were a lot of these after all these theories and whatnot, were they a cause from each one, like functionalism, and then sparked another one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And this history and systems stuff, Cameron, is kind of hard to keep in your brain because, are you a psychology major? Yep. Yeah. So this is probably all new information, right? And so this is an example of, again, when I had said sort of reading the text beforehand kind of helps give some context and anchors and things like that. I'm not sort of saying that you did or didn't, but it's hard to keep sort of where things fall. And so when you're going through and studying, if you think about this leading to this, leading to this, leading to this, it's kind of a nice way to go through and keep some of this organized in your head. Yeah. All right. One thing, and we'll get to these at the end of each one of these lectures, folks, there's a lecture summary slide and a comprehension check slide. Lecture summary is just kind of going through and summarizing kind of the big topic sort of issues here, and sort of definitely go through when you're preparing, go through and make sure that you've got a good handle on this stuff. And then the comprehension check, if you can do these just off the top of your head without referring to your notes, if you can answer these to your roommate who's not in this class and do it well, you're going to be pretty good with this stuff. So definitely make use of those as you're going through with prep. Okay. Any other questions?
This question's not really about the discussion, but should we have the second module read and taken notes of by next time? Or
Colin, that would be great if you did that. If you can do that, you're going to be on point. So the next section we're going to go through is talking about research methods and things like that, which is another thing that can be kind of tough to get your head wrapped around sometimes. So if you can read that, take notes on that before we come in next or on Friday, that's going to put you in the best position. So try to do that. If you don't, and this is another thing to see as we go through. Some people, if you've had previous exposure to this stuff, you may pick it up pretty quickly, and you'll find that you're doing pretty well on some of the quizzes. If it's completely new material, you might take a little bit more time to get it picked up. And so, again, with having those biweekly quizzes, the nice thing is it's going to help you start to shape sort of what you need to do. I would say for this first unit, overshoot your mark. You can always scale back as we move forward if you blow this next one out of the water, or this first one out of the water. Yeah, that's in the syllabus. I think it's just module 2, but go through, check the syllabus. They're all listed in there. Any other questions? All right, cool, folks. Enjoy the rest of your day. Let me know if you have any questions. And again, remember, if you want to catch up during office hours or something like that, just shoot me an email, and I'll kick you out a link and we'll get set up. When do I have? Well, I don't think I have office hours today. I have office hours on Thursday, but cool. All right. Well, keep an eye out for announcements. I'll get this recorded and posted onto that links page so you can go back through, clarify your notes if you need that. Otherwise, thanks everybody for jumping in today, and we'll catch you on Friday. See ya.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you.